The Twelfth Night Feast is a subject that is almost exclusively painted by the Dutch Baroque artist Jan Steen. The Twelfth Night Feast is also known as the Epiphany Feast. It takes place on January 6, the day that the three kings or magi supposedly visited baby Jesus. It's 12 days after Christmas and marks the end of the Christmas celebrations. In Jan Steen's country, current-day the Netherlands, religious people would celebrate this evening with their families. The feast was originally a Catholic one, but it was also celebrated by the Protestants, who formed the majority in 17th century the Netherlands. And as you can see in Steen's works, these parties could be quite wild, involving excessive drinking and lustful behaviors. For the 12th Night Feast, one of the participants was randomly chosen to be the king for the evening. He or she would wear a crown, like in this version from the 1660s. The youngest family member standing on the table was chosen to be the king, and he wears a paper crown. Why a king? Well, depending on the regional variation, the king would either refer to one of the three kings that visited Jesus, and in that case, the king would be good-natured. But the king could also refer to King Herod, who wanted to kill Jesus. In that case, which Steen preferred, the king would be the leader of the misrule and chaos. In the 17th century, people believed that Herod was a drunkard, and his character thus perfectly fitted with this wild feast. In this version of 1661, Steen emphasized the foolishness of the king by having him put his foot on some bellows. And then there is a third possibility, which is that the king represents Jesus, and that is perhaps why Steen chose a young child as the king in several of his compositions. It is obviously an ironic reference, as the king in these scenes initiates a wild evening. But it would fit with the legend that the three magi reportedly said, "The king drinks," when Jesus first suckled on his mother's breast, something that I will get back to in a bit. There were two different ways to choose the king. One way was to draw lots, and the other, more fun way was to bake a large pie in which a single bean was hidden. The cake was then served to all participants, and the one finding the bean in their slice would be the king. This person was sometimes also referred to as the Bean King. The single bean was a symbol for the biblical star that guided the three kings to the location where Jesus was born. In some instances, people used a silver coin instead of a bean. I mentioned earlier that Jan Steen was one of the only people painting this feast. But 2 decades before, this theme was also painted several times by the Flemish artist Jacob Jordaens, as you can see here. In this painting by Jordaens, the old man at the head of the table is the Bean King. So after the king was chosen, he or she could appoint other court members and officials, like a pastor, priest, a judge, a fool, a glutton, etc. For example, in this version, the king is flanked by a fool on the left and a lady representing gluttony on the right side of the painting. And in this version from 1664, you can see the preacher sitting on the right side of the table, recognizable by his black hat with a piece of paper stuck to it. And the lady to the right of him once again represents gluttony. And in this 1668 version, there's a nun encouraging the young king to drink. Just remember, these were just roles that these people played for this evening, and not just some fantasy of the artist. Before the indoor celebrations captured by Steen here, the party would go outside and process to the streets where they would sing songs related to the three magi and King Herod. On the stairs here, you can see some people part of another party who would visit the house singing these songs. If you look carefully, you can see half of a white star in the door opening, a reference to the biblical star. And the boy on the steps is holding a so-called rommelpot, a primitive music instrument to accompany their songs. Eventually, the party would end up in a tavern or return home where the eating and drinking would start. Although there are some regional variations on how this feast was celebrated, one important moment was that the guests were supposed to wait drinking until the king took his first sip. Your dance has captured this significant moment, with the king taking his sip and the others raising their glass while shouting, "The king drinks!" However, as you can see in this painting, and in many of Steen's interpretations of this moment, the other people were not always that patient. Looking at the paintings by Jan Steen, there are various symbolic references that we can discover. For example, look at the right foreground of this version at the Royal Collection Trust. In front of the small girl are 3 candles placed on the floor, which refer to the 3 kings that visited Jesus. The broken eggshells on the floor traditionally refer to the fragility of life, but in this case they are also a reference to the chaos of this party and the traditional food for the 12th Night Feast, which is waffles, which you can see in most of the paintings by Steen on this subject. You can also often see an empty pan in which the waffles were made, sometimes with a dog licking the leftovers. And if you look at the foreground of some of these works, you may discover some drawings or proverbs on the wall. For example, behind the king here is a piece of paper with 2 monkeys drawn on there, as well as some text, though hard to read, saying, "What use are candle and glasses if the owl won't look?" Which basically refers to willful ignorance, meaning that even with the right tools or resources, like glasses or light, if an individual is not open to learning or understanding, they will not benefit from these aids. Finally, Steen made a habit of including himself in some of these parties. For example, the man holding up the 3 clay pipes in the center background is a self-portrait. And in this other version, Steen is once again seated at the center of the table. Well, I hope you learned something about this pretty unusual tradition, which Steen painted repeatedly. I'm curious what your thoughts are about these works and if you have any further questions or observations. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and don't forget to hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.